My comments are mostly going to focus on the recovery of the New Orleans metro area because that's my area of knowledge. But I think Hurricanes Gustav and Ike were a current reminder of how vulnerable the entire Gulf Coast, its economic assets, and communities are. And perhaps what we learned today can provide guidance not only for policies about Gulf Coast recovery from Katrina and Rita, but also guidance to help Galveston, Houston, Lake Charles, and coastal Louisiana recover from the devastating blow dealt by Hurricane Ike this past Friday and Saturday. On a regular basis, in collaboration with the Brookings Institution, we publish the New Orleans Index to track the recovery of New Orleans. And from our most recent edition, this is a summary of our findings. Greater New Orleans approaches the end of its third year of recovery with the vast majority of its pre-storm population and jobs. But recovery trends have slowed or stagnated, and tens of thousands of blighted properties, lack of affordable housing for essential workers, and thin public services continue to plague the city and region. So talking about population, here is our frequent and timely measure of repopulation that we use. We track households actively receiving mail. Using this measure, the New Orleans metro area has regained 87% of its pre-Katrina population levels, and New Orleans has regained 72%. But as you can see, population growth has slowed in the last year. Within New Orleans itself, a majority of the city's households now are up above sea level. Now I'll talk about the economy. The New Orleans metro lost many jobs after Katrina, as you can see from the gray line, and every year has been regaining jobs. The green line for 2008 shows that New Orleans has regained 87% of jobs, but job growth has slowed. And similarly, labor force growth has slowed. And as you can see from the green line for 2008, it is currently 83% of pre-Katrina. A smaller labor force has kept unemployment low in the New Orleans area, currently at 4.1%. So while the New Orleans area economy is growing, employers are struggling to find workers. Job vacancy rates in low-wage occupations like food preparation and serving have quadrupled. Job vacancy rates have more than doubled in occupations essential to recovery like architecture and engineering and installation, maintenance and repair, building grounds, cleaning and maintenance. This is due to job training needs and also lack of housing for workers. In regard to housing, the majority of the Community Development Block Grant supplemental funding provided to coastal states was designated for housing, much of it for homeowners. The majority of the $13 billion funding provided to Louisiana was allocated to the Road Home program, which provides rebuilding grants to underinsured homeowners. To date, 75% of homeowners determined to be eligible have received funding. But the pace of home reconstruction in New Orleans has slowed, as you can see from this graph of repair permits. A recent study by PolicyLink indicated that although road home grants continue to be dispersed, 70 to 80% of road home recipients are not receiving sufficient funds combined with insurance proceeds to rebuild. The average road home applicant is short $35,000, due largely to program rules that base compensation on pre-Katrina home values, which were low in lower-income, historically African-American neighborhoods. One policy area that has not received sufficient attention is affordable rental housing. Rents have increased 46% in the New Orleans metro since Katrina. This has caused a significant housing affordability issue in the New Orleans area. While rents have increased 46%, wages have increased only 22%. Looking at the average wages for specific job categories, we see that workers in those occupations facing labor shortages such as maintenance and repair, as well as child care, waiters and waitresses, nurses' aides, etc., cannot afford housing in the area unless they spend more than 30% of their monthly income on rent. FEMA provided rental assistance for many Katrina-affected families. These disaster vouchers are now administered by HUD and will expire in March of 2009. Nearly 14,000 families in the New Orleans region and a total of 28,000 families across the Gulf Coast and nation are receiving these vouchers. Their expiration will be a pressing issue when the next administration takes office. On to infrastructure. 3 years after Katrina, localities in Louisiana and Mississippi have received slightly more than half of the FEMA funds obligated to them. Although funds for debris removal have largely been paid, funds for permanent repairs to sewer systems, police stations, schools, roads, etc. have moved slowly. And now I want to talk a little bit about flood risk for New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. About New Orleans, The Army Corps has been authorized to build a levee system for the New Orleans area that will protect from storm surge associated with a 100-year storm. That's a storm that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. This system is scheduled to be complete in 2011. This map depicts the Army Corps' flood risk model based on construction completed as of June 2007. The darkest blue areas indicate 8 feet of flooding or more. This model indicates that as of June 2007, most of New Orleans faces the same risk of flooding from a major storm as it did before Katrina. Now, if we flip to the next one, you'll see that when it is completed, this system will greatly reduce risk of deep flooding from a 1% storm. But if we go a little farther, Katrina was stronger than a 1% storm. It was a 0.25% storm or a 400-year storm. Although measurements aren't complete, it's likely that Ike was stronger than a 1% storm as well. Army Corps flood models for a 500-year storm or a 0.2% storm indicate that the New Orleans levee system will not provide sufficient protection against a storm of that strength, as you can see from the 4 to 8 feet of flooding anticipated in many parts of town. Note that these last two maps only depict a small portion of New Orleans. The Army Corps has maps that demonstrate the risk to the entire area, but they couldn't get them to us this last week because they were very busy with Hurricane Ike. The levee system is meant to be the secondary line of defense against storm surge in the region. The primary line of defense are wetlands, which have been greatly depleted in recent history. This map shows the historical land loss in southeast Louisiana over the last 76 years and projecting forward 42 years. These wetlands and barrier islands protect not only New Orleans, but all of southern Louisiana and coastal Mississippi as well. Wetlands also protect essential oil and gas infrastructure along the Gulf Coast. Louisiana has dedicated $1 billion of its own funding for wetland restoration and flood protection, but this is a very small first step, as upwards of $20 billion may be needed for coastal restoration in Louisiana. Coastal protection reduces the cost of levee construction and maintenance. It's more self-sufficient over the long term. It better protects the infrastructure associated with nationally vital coastal industries like energy and gas than levee construction. But as a policy area, coastal restoration has been neglected at the federal level, leaving New Orleans, coastal Mississippi, and many Louisiana towns that support the energy sector at continued risk of catastrophic flooding, and I think Ike demonstrated that this weekend. I want to touch on Hurricane Gustav. It was an impressive test of the combined federal, state, and local government's abilities to execute and manage a mass evacuation. The various levels of government worked well together and communicated effectively. Evacuations of the poor, hospitalized, and elderly worked. Contraflow worked. Looting and mayhem were basically non-existent. But this large-scale mandatory evacuation came at a federal cost of about $210 million, an expenditure that would likely not be necessary if southern Louisiana had sufficient flood protection, including restored wetlands. Beyond the mandatory evacuation of South Louisiana, there you go. Gustav had far-reaching effects. This map shows the number of days each parish or county in Louisiana has been without power since Gustav. One story the media overlooked was the wind damage to Baton Rouge and the rest of Louisiana, which was far more severe than the damage to New Orleans from this storm. As major storms increase in frequency and intensity, the nation will continue to face significant infrastructure challenges that will require the next administration's attention. Ike reinforced this point in the Houston area this weekend.